Okay. Welcome to today's academic series hosted by Campaign Lab and myself, Douglas Scott, on behalf of Campaign Lab. Today, we're joined by Professor Charles Pattie. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield, where he has taught since 1994, although I believe you're originally teaching in geography and have moved on to politics since then. Now in the School of Sociological Studies, Politics and International Relations. Professor Pattie has worked on elections and voting with a particular focus on the influence of local context on voters and parties' behavior and the decision making. He's written widely on various election-related topics, including electoral systems and redistricting, economic voting, election campaigning, and the neighborhood effect, as well as political participation. Thank you, Charles. Before I let you begin, just a quick word and a quick reminder to everyone attending today. This event is recorded. We will share the recording most probably sometime next week on our YouTube channel. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation where you can ask questions. So you can give Charles your questions. We will have another event around about the same time next month, but I will get back to everyone a little later on who will be speaking at that one. Without further ado, over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Douglas. Thanks for having me. And I want to take you back just over a year to the last election, because I think it is quite an interesting moment in British electoral politics. And I'll try and convince you that some of that has to do with how the electoral system itself operated to create a very striking result. So I'm going to talk a bit about how electoral bias, particularly between Conservative and Labour, operated in that election and what created that bias, and the extent to which that sets up a situation for the next election, whenever that may be. So I hope you can see my slides, but I thought as a reminder, we might start just by reminding ourselves just what an odd event 2024 actually was. So I've got here the shift in the number of MPs between 2019 and 2024, and then the shift in the parties' respective shares of the vote. And a story we all know quite well. Of course, the Conservatives went from a substantial majority in 2019 to I think the worst ever result for the Conservative Party in terms of their MPs, in terms of the share of the vote. A very successful party hit a brick wall. We saw a recovery for the Liberal Democrats in terms of their number of MPs, and of course we saw a massive shift in the representation in Parliament from around about 200 MPs to 411 Labour MPs. And the striking thing, I think, is that while the Conservative vote tumbled, the Labour vote didn't actually increase by that much. So this huge swing in MPs to Labour comes without much of an improvement in Labour's actual position. And similarly, the improvement in the Liberal Democrats' position, although I won't talk about that quite so much, comes without much change in the Lib Dem vote, whereas, of course, as we know, parties like Reform came through very strongly in 2024 in terms of the vote, but didn't really have much of a improvement in the representation in Parliament. That's a lot to do with how the electoral system itself operates. So let me just try and put that into context. So if we compare that to post-war elections, what I'll try to do in this slide is to look at every election between 1945 and 2019, and the blue bars are the government majority in MPs at each election, and the orange line is the largest party's share of the national vote. And as you can see, election to election, the size of the government majority bounces around. Sometimes it's quite large, sometimes it's quite small. Sometimes, of course, at least twice we've had minority governments. And the largest party share of the vote has bounced around. It's slid somewhat over the years, but it has bounced around. But it turns out there's no correlation whatsoever between how popular the largest party is in terms of vote and the majority in the House of Commons. If anyone's interested in these things, the correlation coefficient's minus 0.003, which is near as damn it nothing at all. So that's the situation up until 2019. I just want to kind of highlight just how odd 2024 is, because here's 2024 suddenly adding to our picture. So as you can see, in 2024, we've actually got one of the largest majorities for a post-war government in terms of MPs. We've got to go back to 1997 to see something similar. But we've also got the lowest share of the vote by the largest party. So Labour's huge success in the Commons is built on this rather odd foundation of a rather mediocre, actually worse than mediocre, national vote share. That's quite striking. And of course, that reflects a feature of first past the post elections, which is quite familiar, which is their tendency to create disproportional results, and particularly to exaggerate the largest party's representation in Parliament. So part of this has to do with how disproportional the election is. I won't go into the maths of this, but I'm going to show you some figures based on the Gallagher Index of Disproportionality, which is quite a famous one. It's basically comparing each party's share of the vote to its share of the seats. And the index works by running from 0 to 100. 0 means perfect proportionality, 100 means perfect disproportionality. So in a situation where we have 100, one party might get all the seats in Parliament from its no votes, and that'd be an extraordinary disproportional result. So how do British elections look? And again, if you look at 1945 onwards period, here's the Gallagher Index for elections since 1945. And again, it bounces around, relatively proportional in the early 50s, getting more disproportional on average over time, up until 2017, which was actually not too bad by British standards. Well, hopefully my internet's going to stand up. Getting a bit more disproportional in 2019, but again, this just emphasises, I think, just how odd 2024 is, because here comes 2024, very disproportional by UK standards. It's the most disproportional election result I can find in the recent record in the UK. Very, very odd indeed. So something's going on in 2024 with how the electoral system has worked between the parties. And I want to spend the rest of the talk just trying to reflect on what sorts of things might explain this very peculiar result. So why did we get such an odd result? I think the first thing I want to try and emphasize here is this isn't just about disproportionality, because in a sense that's not a problem for first past the post. First past the post is meant to be disproportional to some extent. It's kind of baked into how the system is designed. So first past post elections do have this generally recognized property of exaggerating the winner's representation. And it's often seen by supporters of first past the post as an advantage. Obviously, it's also seen by opponents as a disadvantage, but it's what the system is meant to do. So producing a disproportional result in itself isn't a problem per se for first past the post, insofar as it's what the system's meant to achieve. However, why is it quite so disproportional in 2024? Why is it so odd? So to try and get a sense of that, I'm going to talk about a slightly different concept. So it's the concept of electoral bias, which is different from disproportionality. And the basic concept behind trying to get a handle on electoral bias is this. If an electoral system is biased, then two parties that achieve the same share of the vote will get different shares of the seats. If the system is not biased, however it operates, the same share of the national vote should produce more or less the same number of seats in the parliament. So if we can apply that to 2024, for instance, when all Labour got around about a third of the national vote, had the Conservatives got a third of the national vote, would they also have 411 MPs or not? And to assess that, I'm going back to a method that was brought in by a New Zealand political scientist, actually almost 60 years ago, a chap called Ralph Brooks. And Brooks developed an algorithm, if you like, an algebra for working out the bias in first past the post type electoral systems. And in particular, looking at how the system treats one party relative to another, so looking at two parties at a time. And Brooks' kind of basic insight was that if two parties get the same national vote share, they should get the same number of seats if the system is treating them both equally, and is hence unbiased between them. But if one party starts to get more seats than the other, even when the votes are the same, then the system is biased in some respect towards that more advantaged party. And for Brooks, the extra number of seats that party would win compared to its rival, if they both got the same vote share, gives us a rough and ready reckoner, as an indication of how much bias there is in the system. So how do we do this? Well, I've applied this to the 2024 election, and I do it by making an assumption. And it is. I'll put my hands up immediately. It is an assumption. But the assumption is, let's assume that we can rerun the 2024 election. Obviously, if you think of Conservative and Labour, I'm going to concentrate mainly on the Conservative-Labour battle, because that's the one that decided to be the makeup of the government. Obviously, the two parties didn't get the same share of the vote in 2024, but can we play a game and see if they do? So what I've done is I've assumed a nationally uniform swing of the vote from Labour to Conservative of around about 5%. And that's enough to get the national vote shares to tie. But I've assumed that's happened in every single constituency in the country. So for those of you who remember the swingometer in election night broadcasts, I'm assuming that national uniform swingometer used to assume.
How are you?
And I'm going to assume that all the other parties' votes are unchanged. Now, obviously, if that happens, some constituencies are going to change hands, at least notionally. So when Labour and Conservatives tie nationally, how many more or fewer MPs would Labour or the Conservatives win compared to the rival? So without further ado, how does it look? So here's what the 2024 election would look like under my assumptions. So a uniform swing to tie the Labour and Conservative votes. As you can see on the left, the national vote shares are tied around about 29%. The vote shares for all the other parties stay the same. The image I'm interested in is a graph on the right of your screen, which shows the number of MPs each party would win. And we would still see a big Labour representation in the Commons. Labour would end up, under these assumptions, with 99 seats more than the Conservatives in 2024, even if we tied on their national vote shares. Now, that does indicate that a fairly substantial bias in Labour's favour. the electoral system was working very much in Labour's favour in 2024. This wasn't just first past the post doing its usual thing of exaggerating the most popular party. Labour would still have come out ahead, even if they'd been neck and neck in the national vote with the Conservatives, assuming that national uniform swing. Now, one of the reasons I'm using this method from Ralph Brooks is that Brooks allows us to interrogate the sources of that bias to see where it comes from. It can come from a variety of different effects. And Brooks' algebra allows us to work out how big these effects are. So it can come from effects like what's called, I think, called the efficiency effect, the efficiency bias, which is basically the idea of not wasting votes. So in a first past the post system, you don't want to have too many votes piled up in seats that you lose because they don't elect any more MPs. And you don't want to have too many votes piled up in massive majorities in seats that you win because they don't win any more MPs. But ideally, you want to have, if you're going to be really efficient, you'd have no votes in the seats you lose, and you'd have one vote more than the second place party in the seats that you win, and that would be supremely efficient. It'd also be a bit mad from a campaigning point of view, but that's another story. So if one party's vote distribution is more efficient than the other, that will create a bias in favour of the more efficient party. There can be effects based around the electorates of constituencies, either at the level of individual constituencies. We know constituency electorates vary over time. Some get bigger, some get smaller in relative terms. And in the past, certainly, there have been national effects where certainly Scotland and Wales, except Northern Ireland, have had smaller constituencies in terms of their electorates than England, and parties that are more popular in areas with smaller electorates are benefited compared to parties which are more popular in places with larger electorates, just because it takes fewer votes for the party in areas with smaller electorates to have a chance of winning. We can also have turnout effects. Turnout can affect this. So the turnout rate will vary from seat to seat. And although it sounds a bit perverse, and it will sound a bit perverse, I'm quite sure, bizarrely, low turnout can actually help parties, purely because it reduces the number of votes they need to get to win a seat. So low turnout is in a seat, other things being equal, the more of an advantage it is for the winner because it takes fewer votes to win. So if one party is more popular, where turnout tends to be lower, and the other is more popular, where turnout tends to be higher, the former party gets an advantage. And of course, we're in a multi-party system, so the other parties will affect the story too. It's not just the two parties we're examining at any given point in time. Other parties will have an impact. Third-party votes will tend to help parties which win seats where the third parties are popular but don't quite win, because again it reduces the number of votes they need to win. But when the third party starts to win, if one of the two parties we're looking at for the bias calculation is more popular, where third parties tend to win, that's a problem for that party because it's losing votes to other parties. So if we do that, how does this look? So here's the 2024 bias broken down into its components. And on the left, we've got the total, the net bias, about 99 seats for Labour. Positive bars here represent a bias that works for Labour. Negative bars works with Conservatives. So the basic story is that the efficiency bias, the turnout bias, and the third-party wins bias in 2024 worked in Labour's favour. The constituency size bias in the national electorates bias, the Scotland-Wales effect, didn't really help anyone. That we can talk about why that is. It's because of the 2011 legislation on redistricting. But we can perhaps park that for later. But third-party votes biases helped the Conservatives. And just to illustrate that, That's how big these things were. So the efficiency bias was worth an extra 30 seats for Labour. The turnout bias was worth an extra 40 seats for Labour relative to the Conservatives. Third parties wins bias was worth an extra 56 seats for Labour, and the third party votes bias helped the Conservatives to the tune of 27 more seats for the Conservatives relative to Labour. Why was that? Well, partly it's because Labour's vote was much more efficiently distributed in 2024 than the Conservatives was. So what I've done here is look both at the actual election on the left-hand side, the actual results on the left-hand side, and how this would have looked in the my pretend election, where Labour and Conservative tie on national vote shares on the right-hand side. And I'm looking at, for each party, at the percentage of its votes that's either completely wasted, so is cast in seats the party loses, or is surplus, so is extra votes over and above the minimum it needed to win in seats where it won. And you can see that the bar, the total bar of all those votes, which are basically not contributing to any more MPs, was higher in 2024 for the Conservatives than it was for Labour, both in the actual election and in the pretend election where they tie on vote shares. Labour wasn't wasting as many votes, had a more efficient vote spread, and that helped it. That was a useful thing for Labour. Similarly, both in terms of the actual vote on the left-hand side, the actual election on the left-hand side, and the election where I've tied the two parties' national vote shares, the turnout bias helped Labour because turnout tended to be lower on average, a bit lower on average in Labour seats than in Conservative seats. So again, Labour needed fewer voters to actually win the seat than the Conservatives needed because it was facing lower turnout, and that tended to help. And then the third party effects. On the left-hand graph, I'm looking at seats where the third party won. So neither Labour nor the Conservatives won. And third-party votes tended to be, on average, higher in, the Conservatives' votes tended to be higher in seats that third parties won than Labour's vote was. So Labour wasn't throwing away as many votes in seats where third parties were going to win. Which is why the third party wins effect helped Labour. But for the Conservatives, it's working the other way around. Where third parties didn't win the seat, this helped the Conservatives a bit because in Conservative seats, there's a slightly higher total third party vote than there was in Labour seats. In other words, Conservatives needed fewer votes overall to win the seat. So what was giving us a sense of is where that Labour advantage came from. It came partly from a very efficient vote distribution relative to the Conservatives, and it came partly from turnout effects, and it came partly from, particularly from the third party effect. Again, how does this compare over time? So again, I've looked over 1950 to the present, and I've looked to try and get a sense of how much the bias in the electoral system over that period between Conservative and Labour was unusual in 2024. So this graph's showing you the net Conservative Labour bias. If it's above the black horizontal line, the bias is working in Labour's favour. If it's below the line, it's working in the Conservatives' favour. And again, at each election, I've rerun the election, assuming that the two parties were tied on their national vote shares. And under those circumstances, 2024 was quite a big Labour advantage. It was certainly comparable to the sorts of advantages Labour was getting out of the electoral system in the new Labour years, 1997 to 2010. But it's not completely out of line with that net bias. It's a high pro-Labour net bias, but it's not that unusual in recent terms. And that's kind of an intriguing story in itself. In terms of the constituency effects and the national effects, I'll just touch on this very quickly, because basically that effect's vanished, and it's vanished because of the 2011 legislation on how parliamentary constituencies are now redrawn. So for the first time in modern British history, constituencies have to be redrawn with a very tight control on their electorate size, and that reduces this effect to almost zero. In the past, it used to seesaw around as constituencies got older. Labour tended to get an advantage over time, because the places that were losing electorate in relative terms tended to be more Labour voting. The places that were gaining voters tended to be more Conservative voting. So as constituencies changed, it aged over time. Labour gained an advantage from this. And then each time the boundaries were redrawn, the advantage dropped for Labour and moved relatively back towards the Conservatives, which is like the seesaw pattern. But that effect's now vanished. It's now no longer there because of legislative change. So we can ignore that. The efficiency bias and the turnout biases have bounced around over time. The turnout bias, certainly since the 50s, has tended to favour Labour. The efficiency bias helped the Conservatives up until the early 90s, helped Labour from the early 90s to about 2005. Then it helped the Conservatives quite substantially. Now it's helping Labour again. But again, you can see that the efficiency effect, the solid black line, isn't that unusual. It's not that far out of line compared to the sorts of biases that Labour was benefiting from in the new Labour years. But one thing that is quite different, is quite striking, is the third-party effects. The third-party votes effect has tended to help the Conservatives over the years. That's the orangey line, and it did so in the most recent election. The third-party wins effect has tended to help Labour a bit, because the main third-party winning seats has since the 70s been the Liberals, the Liberal Democrats more recently, and they tend to take more seats from the Conservatives than from Labour. Hence, this affects Labour. In 2015, that shifted because the SNP took a lot of Labour seats in Scotland, so this effect actually began to help the Conservatives relative to Labour. It's now helping Labour once again because of that big Liberal Democrat revival in 2024, but it's now helping Labour more than it's ever helped Labour in the past. So this is one of the big shifts, I think. The Lib Dem revival in 2024 really did help Labour quite substantially to maximise its representation in Parliament based on a fairly mediocre vote. So what I think that shows us is that in some ways what happened in 2024 in terms of how the electoral system operated between Conservative and Labour was comparable to what was happening in the new Labour period, certainly from 1997 to 2005, which was the previous high watermark of electoral bias in Labour's favour. But in other ways, it kind of moves to I guess trying to speculate on where this takes us. In other ways, the situation now is actually very different to the situation back in that new Labour period. Why? Well, one feature of this is that Labour is actually much more vulnerable now than it was in 1997. This isn't a surprise, I don't think, but just to show you, I've taken all the Labour-held seats in 1997 on the left-hand side, and all the Labour-held seats in 2024 on the right-hand side, and I've drawn a histogram for each election of how many seats have a particular majority, and you can see that in 1997 on the left-hand side, there were lots of Labour-held seats where Labour had a really substantial majority. And the median point would have been a seat with a Labour seat with a majority of 30% over its nearest rival. And it takes a big swing against Labour for lots of those seats to disappear. So Labour was fairly secure in 1997. Contrast that with 2024 on the right, a median Labour majority of only 17% in seats held in 2024. Lots of seats with quite low majorities for Labour. So it doesn't take a terribly big swing against Labour for Labour to suddenly start losing lots of seats in 2024. But that's not all. There are other things about 2024 which are different. So Labour was much more vulnerable. Other oddities of 2024 includes, for those who follow the Dems, a party that's been routinely quite badly treated by first past the post down the years. It wasn't in 2024. A bizarre little factoid is that 2024 is the only election in modern times where the Liberal Democrats have actually been proportionally represented in Parliament. Here's a little thought for you. 12% of the vote gave them 11% of the MPs. And actually, they were the only major party that got near proportionality in 2024. So they did quite well, considering. 2024 was, as we know, a disaster for the Conservative Party. It's the lowest ever election vote share. Remember, the Conservatives are probably the most successful party in electoral history anywhere in the world. This was a disaster for them. And it's a disaster also in terms of the representation in Parliament, the lowest ever parliamentary representation, only 121 MPs. And as we know, unusually, things have got worse for them in the years since the election. Usually you'd expect oppositions to see the vote rise a bit after, in the year or two after an election, as the government does on popular things. That hasn't happened for the Conservatives. Another really important shift, I think, between 1997 and now is the electorate now is much, much more volatile than it was in 1997. So just as a marker of that, if you look at the British election study, so the main survey of the UK electorate, just over a quarter of voters changed their minds, changed their allegiance between the 1992 election and the 1997 election. But just under 3/4 didn't, stayed with the same party. In 2024, 44% of voters had changed their minds compared to 2019. And that's the highest turnover change in party support from one election to another. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that voters are now much more volatile. So Labour's base now is weaker than it was in 1997, and they can be less reliant on the loyalty of the voters. And of course, we've got this massive wild card of reform, which is leading in the polls a year after the election. What does that mean? Well, just the last couple of slides I just want to kind of speculate into the future a little bit. In some respects, we are stepping into the unknown. So I've put up here the electoral calculus poll of polls up until just a few weeks ago. So from the election in 2024 up until just early October, late September. And as we're all kind of familiar with this, Labour support has gone from being mediocre to being really quite disastrous. Just over 1 in 5 voters now saying they'd vote Labour. The Conservatives have done even worse. Only about 16-17% of voters saying they vote Conservative now, compared to around about a quarter in the election. We'd usually expect the Conservatives' vote to be picking up as Labour's vote goes down. This is bad news for the Conservatives. The Greens and the Lib Dems gradually slowly edging up, but the big shift has been that rise in the reform vote from 15% to 30%. And of course, those who follow these things will be looking at some of the fancy new MRP polls that the polling companies use now to project from the opinion polls to likely outcomes in the election. And this is the latest, just one example, the latest YouGov MRP projection. As of the end of September, they were seeing Reform as the most popular party with about 27% of the vote, Labour down at about 21%, Lib Dems on 15%, Conservatives on 17%, and so on. And from that, they were projecting a likely outcome of 311 Reform MPs, only 144 Labour MPs, so Labour's vote going down very substantially, and only 78 Lib Dems, quite good for Lib Dems, partly, but only 45 Conservatives. Good grief. Now, whether that happens or not come the next election is, frankly, anyone's guess. I think we're now in such a volatile world that trying to think several years ahead is even more of a fool's game than it once was. But I think just one thought, and I'll also throw things open for some discussion. One thought is, given where the major parties are, well, where actually all the parties are in terms of the vote share now, we're getting into a world where first past the post can actually work in really strange and quirky ways. As we look into the future, although the 2024 election really worked heavily in Labour's favour, was very biased in Labour's favour, we can't assume that will be the case in the future. And it doesn't take very much of a shift in the relative balance of the parties for very odd things to start to happen once the parties start to drop down to the levels of support that we're seeing now. So buckle up, it could be a bumpy ride. And perhaps at that point, I'll stop and I'll throw open to you yeah.
Thank you so much, Charles. I do have questions lined up, but I see a couple of hands up, and I want to hand it over to everyone else first. But fascinating so far. No, I saw you had your hand up first, and then Mark.
Yeah, so I do have a question. Thank you very much for your talk, first of all. So I'm interested. Obviously, there's lots of polls are quite volatile, data is changing all the time, but I'm quite interested in how the efficiency effects that we've been looking at might affect an ascendant Reform Party. And the question that I have essentially is, have you done any modelling around looking at some of the kind of projected data and polling data, and then thinking about how the efficiency effect, not just efficiency, but how the various effects you were describing might be affecting Reform, where they're likely to get boons from first past the post, where they're likely to find drag. I suppose in this context, rather unusually, third-party voting effects will include the Conservatives. But essentially, my question is, have you done any kind of modelling about that? And do you have any thoughts, if so, or even if not, about what we're likely to see?
We have looked at how the electoral system played for Reform in 2024. I've not pushed that forward to look at how it might be operating for them now, which is perhaps a more interesting question in a sense. In 2024, it very obviously worked quite dramatically against them. I guess one marker of that is 15% of the vote they got five MPs, the Lib Dems did worse than Reform in terms of the vote share, but got many more MPs. So that was a problem for Reform, and it seems to be because the vote just wasn't quite high enough in enough constituencies to get them over the threshold. So they wasted vast quantities of the vote. Given where they are now in the polls, it does look as though Reform are likely to take a lot of seats from Labour. As we saw, Labour is currently sitting with lots of seats that are very vulnerable to quite small shifts in vote share. We could flip quite fast from Reform having a very inefficient distribution of votes to having a very efficient distribution of votes, winning a lot of seats by just a little bit. And it's part of what I was trying to refer to at the end. That's that kind of sense of we're now, the parties are now so mutually unpopular, and there's so few truly safe seats left that really quite small shifts can have in support kind of very radical effects in terms of where the parties start to win. So if I put my neck out, I took a risk. My guess is Reform is going to make has potential to make big inroads into both Conservative and Labour seats. I suspect they'll probably do that with quite small majorities. So the efficiency bias would probably work heavily in their favour. Of course, that leaves them, as it's left Labour this time round, vulnerable at a future election, because if you have a very efficient vote distribution, it doesn't take much to turn that from efficient to wasted, because you're holding on to your seats by quite narrow margins. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, I was also going to talk about, or ask you to talk a bit more about the efficiency effect with respect to Reform in the next election. But I think you've answered that pretty well. And you know, we look forward to having the tables turned on us and what can we do to get in the way of that process. But now I've got you. I've been involved for years in winkling out Labour votes, winkling out Labour promise, and the simple story that we've always told is a high turnout benefits Labour, even though quite often it doesn't benefit Labour particularly. So in other words, our votes are quite difficult to get out. So if you get them out, that's very worth doing. But you appear to be saying something much more sophisticated when you talked about turnout. Can you just maybe simplify that for somebody like me?
Yeah, it's so one way of thinking about this is what I'm trying to look at here is the number of votes a party receives in an election. How many seats does that generate? So you could think of it in terms of how many voters per seat. Now, the turnout effect tends to help Labour because Labour tends to be more popular in seats where turnout tends to be lower. The Conservatives tend to be more popular where turnout tends to be higher. That means if the seats are all of the same electorate size, which more or less they are now, that means Labour needs fewer votes per MP than the Conservatives need. And to that extent, it does help Labour. I think one of the answers to your paradox, so the expectation that higher turnout benefits Labour, because we know that certainly on past history, the sorts of voters who are less likely to turn out tend to be the sorts of voters who are more likely to lean towards Labour, although perhaps in the future they might also be more likely to lean towards Reform. Be careful what you wish for. But the answer I think, to your paradox of high turnout gets out more Labour voters, but why doesn't that necessarily turn into more Labour seats, is that very often what's happening is by increasing turnout among Labour voters, that yields the biggest returns in seats Labour already holds. So it's increasing the majority in seats Labour already holds. And to that extent, that turnout, while it's kind of psychologically satisfying, isn't creating more MPs. So it's that kind of paradox of efficiency versus maximizing the public support. Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? I do have a question myself. Other questions? Oh, Charles. Charles, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I know your data isn't specifically looking at that, but are you aware of any differences in trends between constituencies in cities and those in small towns or rural areas?
Yes, yeah, I've not looked at it for this, but the bigger effect that we've seen in recent contests has been between particularly this large, very metropolitan cities. I guess when we think of obviously London, Manchester, etc. Versus smaller towns, and that's tended to be a pattern whereby, and we saw it in the Brexit referendum as well, where those more metropolitan major urban centres were much more likely to vote to remain. That carries through into recent elections where they've also been relatively successful areas for Labour very often, and more so than the small towns effect. Of course, in 2019, of course, the story was very much about the collapse of the Red Wall. There is an it is tricky because there is an interesting regional effect as well. So in 2024, for instance, I think one of the intriguing trends was the way that the Conservative vote didn't hold up in as well as one might expect in many of the sort of affluent southeast of England's commuter belt towns and cities that where previously the Conservatives attempted to do relatively well. And again, that does seem to be the more sort of socially liberal young professional part of the Conservative vote are looking elsewhere. So there are some straws in the wind of some big city versus small town effects, but they're not necessarily uniform across the entire country. And again, I think the rise of reform, especially, but also, one might speculate what Zach Polanski might do with the Greens. That might also have an effect on how this plays out in future. So I think we could see some really kind of odd patterns. And one thing that interests me is it's a long time follower of British electoral geography is that some of the stable patterns we've tended to assume were kind of baked in to British electoral geography seem to be melting quite fast. And again, it's well known there's the by-election for a Welsh Senate seat today in Caerphilly. That could be an example of exactly this. So that geography is very, very volatile in a way it hasn't been volatile in the past.
Thank you. I'm going to try and quickly sneak in my question. So there's a growing concern over Labour's perceived vulnerability, something that you mentioned quite a bit in your presentations, the sense of growing vulnerability. I was just wondering if you could please expand on how electoral bias in the first past the post system that we have currently, I mean, in the current political situation, is furthering this vulnerability that Labour is exposed to. And how might this affect Labour in the next election? It's one of the themes that seemed to come out of your presentation today was that there's a need to strengthen the base. Like there's something to be said for inertia, if you will, like having a strong, solid base, and how that just allows you to power through a lot of these elections. And that actually dovetails quite nicely with what one of our previous presenters, the academic series, said, Dr. Stephanie Luke. She was talking about the need, like parties tend to do best when they play to their base and stick to the issues that they're really strong on. And in her case, Labour, like her example for Labour was the NHS, and for Reform it was migration. So whenever Reform talks about migration, they tend to do really well on that issue because it strengthens their base. The same is true for Labour. It was her point, that whenever Labour talks about NHS, it strengthens the base because they got a lot of credibility on this issue. So it's a little bit of a detour, but I want to sort of get back to this notion of strengthening the base and how the system is affecting the vulnerability of Labour for the upcoming for next elections.
Yes, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think we are kind of in the realms of speculation. Steph's got a good point. Parties benefit from having a strong song to sing, and they benefit from being able to shore up the support, and particularly in Labour's position as a party of government, your biggest battle is how do you hold on to the people who supported you last time. The chances of extending your vote further when you're in government are small, so you're always looking to hold on. I think how does that play to the first past the post system and where Labour is at the present? I think the challenge. I think they've got a real difficulty. I think their challenge is partly because there are so many seats where they're sitting in quite small majorities, but it's also because what might attract people in those seats, what might hold on to voters in those seats, will vary depending on where you are. So we've seen, for instance, Labour getting into a right old mess over its welfare policy, and that hasn't helped shore up that part of the Labour base that sees Labour as the party that deals with addressing inequality. And they've damaged themselves on that, and they'll do quite an effort to win that back. But at the same time, they're obviously tacking harder on immigration to try and shore up the reform base. But that appeals to different places, to the sorts of places where appeals to protecting the public sector might appeal. So they're not necessarily appealing to the same voters in the same places. And I think they face a bit of a risk of not quite knowing which way to turn. Which part of the base do you need to shore up? And that, I think, leaves them vulnerable. So I think they are in a sticky position. Do they talk to traditional Labour values? Do they talk tough on immigration? Do they tack back, as Rachel Reeves was trying to do the other day on Brexit? What do they do? And given the support they got last time, where that support came from, there's a risk for them that one part of the message will undermine this part of the base, another part of the message will undermine that part of the base. So they could find themselves in a situation where they're trying to please everyone, they please no one, and that could actually cause them a lot of trouble. Because again, it doesn't take much of a drop in their support for a lot of seats to suddenly start tumbling.
Thank you for that. I'm going to allow you to take one more question, and then we've got to wrap this up with the poll and the quiz. Nicola, I see you got your hand up.
Sorry then. Hi, I'm Nicola. I'm a council candidate in Sheffield. And where we are, Labour's decided that they're entirely focused on fighting reform. And I just wondered if you think that's the right idea, because the reform areas are the ones that Labour has just assumed are safe for so long.
Yeah.
So they've not worked them. And I don't think you can necessarily reform. I can see why, because like my area is Lib Dem, so it's not so bad having a Lib Dem councillor in. But potentially other areas might be more winnable. I don't know, your thoughts on sort of like going, well, we haven't worked that area and they're likely to vote reform, so let's just leave that area.
Yeah,
Because I think that it's going to end up how you're describing, with reform here and Labour here.
Yeah, that's the risk, isn't it? And I think as a lifelong whiskey drinker, okay, why would you buy a bottle of Aldi's cheap blend when you can buy a bottle of Lefroy? Go for the original and go for the best. And in the way that applies to the reform thing, but reform has credibility in the stories it tells, but partly because they haven't been tested. But they own those issues, and Labour doesn't. But so if Labour's campaigning on reform territory, well, why wouldn't you vote for reform anyway? You know, why vote for a party that's doing it for reasons of electoral survival, rather than a party that's doing it because it seems to believe it? And I think that's a problem for Labour. And I think you're right. More widely, there is a campaigning issue. Part of the reason for Labour's efficiency in its vote share is it has, for quite a few years now, tended to ignore seats it can't possibly win, and it's tended to ignore seats where it's assumed it's bound to win. And that's been happening for 20 or 30 years. It's a long-term thing. But the risk is, it's exactly what you're describing, that in those places that Labour has assumed it's safe, people feel taken for granted and they start looking for alternatives. And once that unraveling starts, it's very hard to get that genie back in the bottle. And I think there is a risk that of almost too little, too late, in trying to win that back. It's a real problem for them. I think you're right.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to run a little poll now to ask if just for people to give a response. So I'm going to launch it now, and there's also one more question that I've just noticed in the chat from Anthony Green, so I'll read that out. In the meantime, I can see Nicola's also got a hand up, so maybe after, maybe while people are responding to the poll, I'll read Anthony's question and then if Nicola wants to say something. So Anthony's question says, does the traditional electoral math of you aim to take votes off your nearest competitor still apply? I.e., getting voters to switch from your nearest competitor to you puts you 2 ahead of them, whereas other taking votes off other parties only gives you sort of 1 effective vote in that kind of way of thinking about it. And then, I don't know, Nicola, if you had a follow-up there, as your hand was up, but maybe if you want to ask that.
No, sorry, I just forgot to put it down.
Okay, fab. Yeah, Charles, if you want to talk about that.
Oh, crikey, that's an interesting question. I think we are heading into new territory in many respects, and I think it does affect that question of who's your nearest competitor. I'm not sure it's easy for parties to say now who the nearest local competitor actually is, because the assumptions that they tend to work on. The Lib Dems, for instance, famously always have that graph in the leaflet saying Lib Dems winning here, we're the only party that can beat X. They tend to be based on previous elections, but as the Conservative vote collapses, as Labour's vote goes down, as Reform's support seems to go up, give it a guide. It is the last election to who your local rival really is. I'm not entirely sure parties have a good handle on that. There's a risk, I think, of parties trying to fight a conventional battle in an increasingly unconventional world. And I don't think they can take for granted where the vote's going to come from in the future. I think they've all got to work a good deal harder and assume rather less.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We've run out of time today. This was a fascinating presentation. Thank you, Charles.
Pleasure.
And Noam, has everyone filled out the polls yet?
Yeah, I think everybody has filled out the poll. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And I hope to see you all at the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.